Now let's have a look at the second part of what I call the fundamental distinction of jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Remember, jus ad bellum is justice for war. Now we're looking at jus in bello, justice in war. In other words, how do you fight ethically? And there's four categories. So we'll have a look at that in a moment. And but think, you hear expressions like, all's fair in love and war. Okay, well, what is that? That's kind of that's realism, right? That's just saying that, in a sense, you don't really make these kinds of ethical judgments. Anything goes, right? When war happens, the law is silent. Is another expression. So those things express, a kind of descriptive realism, perhaps, that it is the case such that when you have bullets, when you have war, you no longer have ethics. And so that's a descriptive one. It's like, look, that's just what happens, and no matter what we say about it. Or you could take the stronger line that we saw earlier of a prescriptive realism, which is no, actually, once the war starts, that's what should happen. Like all bets are off, and the goal of the war is just to win it. You go to war and you fight it any which way you can in order to win. You don't worry about ethics and all that. And as I mentioned earlier, the great Prussian war theorist of the 19th century, Clausewitz, was essentially a prescriptive realist when it came to fighting. Like once you're in the war, ethics should be set to the side. You play to win, and by playing to win, you bring it to a conclusion fast enough, and so you're ethical. So the result is actually more ethical than if you were worried about the ethics while you're engaged in combat. That's not the just war tradition. The just war tradition is very clear, especially by the time of Hugo Grotius, that there is another dimension of ethics, and that kicks in or has always been there, depending on how you want to interpret this distinction, whether it's a logical one or just a fairly loose one that the terms are all connected. But in any case, in the just war tradition, jus in bello has been, it's not the case that all's fair in love and war, that there is a notion of ethics in warfare. And so we'll have a little bit more of a look at how these categories work. And again, like the rules of the jus ad bellum, there's going to be room for interpretation, how you understand these things. But once again, remember the spirit of the just war tradition was to put restrictions, right, on warfare so that you're forcing people to really justify as much as possible when they engage, and how they engage. So it's in the spirit to put these restrictions on, even if you say the restrictions aren't perfect. Well, laws aren't perfect. We have laws in society to restrict and curb behavior and govern it. People break laws all the time. Well, fortunately not all the time, but laws are often broken, but we don't say, oh, just throw out the laws. We have to find better ways of enforcing them or getting people to conform to them or whatnot. Same thing here. So just because it always hasn't worked out doesn't mean you want to just pitch it out. All right, so let's dig a little bit into these categories. You find these in the Hague and Geneva Conventions. So this is not just sort of a historical work or a philosophical piece or something you find buried in the sociology journals. No, this is it. These are recognized categories by the people that are actually engaged in the world court and in militaries, or et cetera, et cetera. So the first one, if you noticed, is combatants. And with combatants, the thing that's important about this, and there's a huge debate about this, but for our purposes here, is that combatants always must be clearly identifiable, right? That's part of fighting ethically, is that your combatants are clearly identifiable, and that has other ramifications. Who can be legitimately targeted? So you're not supposed to target civilians. Well, you're supposed to, as if you're fighting in a war, make it clear to your enemy which part of your side is civilian and which is military. So where the legitimate targets are and where they are not. Now, it might sound pretty easy to do this. It's not always as, in in every case. For instance, it's pretty easy if you see somebody pushing a baby carriage down the street and then another person is a soldier. Okay, that's pretty clear. But is it as clear when you talk about, well, what about civilians who work at, let's say, a shell making factory, and they're deeply involved? Their whole livelihood is contributing to the war effort. Are they a combatant? And if not, why not? And if they are, why? It seems to be kind of the default that we think of soldiers, people carrying the guns and involved, as a combatant. What about a soldier who's off duty, right? So there are always these stories from World War I, soldiers that are firing at you. Yeah, they're combatants and you're firing back. But what about the soldier that's taking a break and washing her face, or he's having a shave or something like that? Is the soldier at that time really a soldier? Can you just shoot then as well? So you may have certain intuitions on this, and that's understandable. But what we want to do is back those up eventually with arguments, right? So you might say, oh, yeah, soldier's always a soldier. Well, why? And a civilian's always a civilian. Well, why? Or no, some cases they are, some cases they aren't. And once you start to articulate these intuitions, part of the process of articulation is to put reasons and arguments behind them. All right, so this is rooted in the tradition that soldiers were proud to identify themselves, right? You proudly identify yourself as part of an army or part of a regiment. And so this notion of proper warfare being conducted as jus in bello demands also connects up with old notions of honor and dignity in the services. But again, not always clear who counts and who doesn't. Targets, these also have to be very clear, right? And this raises what I talked about earlier, like for certain kinds of targets, you have to be somewhat discriminatory. So is a doctor who serves soldiers a legitimate target? You might say something like, not necessarily, but they're serving the army. Is a politician who started the war a legitimate target? So in that sense, it's not always the same as the combatant, non-combatant distinction. So these are two slightly different dichotomies, but they do have overlapping, but they're not to be regarded as identical. So, but nonetheless, the spirit of the two categories at the beginning is really saying, during the war, what can you legitimately hit and what can you not? And that can be surprisingly difficult. Once you, and hence Clausewitz's line, the more you get involved in these kinds of things, the more difficult it's going to be. And you could end up, even by getting tangled up in all these discussions, you could end up prolonging the war. So this raises questions like, is it better to get it over quickly with maybe possibly more damage, or take the risk of even greater damage over a longer period of time? In any case, the spirit of these two is simply to find out what is legitimate to hit and what is not. All right, so tactics now. And we talked, if you recall, in jus ad bellum, the notion of proportionality, that was like a broad sense of proportionality. Is it better to go to war overall or not? This is sometimes the proportionality that's embedded in this notion of tactics is referred to sometimes as narrow proportionality. So, in a particular military excursion or operation, is it going to create more damage or less damage? Or is it better to do it or not do it? So these are other kinds of proportional considerations that have to be taken into account when you're analyzing whether or not to do something on the battlefield. So it's legitimate also about the intended effects, right? You're supposed to, the intended effects have to lead to the result of a successful operation. So it has to be instrumental in winning the war. You're not allowed to just engage in wanton destruction. So if you want to blow up something of your enemies, and it's, even if it is, let's say you've determined it, it's full of combatants, it's a legitimate target, like the soldiers are on duty, it's a legitimate building or target where they are, you'd still say, well, do we need to do it, right? Maybe you don't, right? So if you don't need to do it, these could be fulfilled, and this one isn't, right? So then the bombing of that is not necessary. It's disproportionate. You can still win the war. You can still do something or achieve your goals without doing that. So even though some of these can be filled, doesn't mean that they're all filled, and then it wouldn't be a legitimate operation. So anyway, so the aims have to be necessarily military in nature, and not wanton destruction, and that is to block, warfare from becoming a kind of terrorism where you're just engaged in trying to terrorize your enemy with that maybe not won't have a direct instrumental value in winning the war. All right. Okay. So. So this goes a lot more. You can have a look at Fro's text where she goes into a lot more detail about all the kinds of tactics that are permissible, but the basic thing is they all have to conform to certain ethical standards, and proportionality is deeply embedded all of this. And you can think of, like also your weapons, the tactics, the weaponry that's used. There's been a long history of debate on what kinds of weapons are legitimate on the battlefield. So if you go in the history of weaponry, you'll see there were lots of debates. Everything from certain kinds of bullets in the 19th and 20th centuries, that whether they were legitimate, whether you had to kill, they had to be clean killing, back to, in the Middle Ages, debating over whether or not, for example, certain kinds of fighters should be allowed to use a crossbow, all kinds of debates. This actually will come up later on when we talk about drone warfare as well. Like, are these legitimate? Is it a legitimate tactic to engage in drone warfare? So again, this is a wide, an expansive category. And the last, but certainly not least, of our discussion here are to engage is the treatment of prisoners. Now, this one is important for a variety of reasons, but simply put, if you are taking prisoners in war, you're supposed to take them when people surrender. You're not supposed to kill soldiers that surrender, and you're supposed to treat them appropriately. No torture, no terrible conditions, no atrocities of anything. Now, that stands to reason simply from a moral perspective, but you can think of the idea of proper treatment of prisoners as from a pragmatic angle. If there's warfare and one side or both sides treat prisoners from the other side in a terrible way, what does that end up doing? Well, it's simply, after the war technically would end, if atrocity stories start coming out, that just prevents, shall we say, the healing that we want after a conflict. Remember, war, the ultimate idea in the just war tradition, was in the service of peace, right? That's the only reason why you fight a war, a just war, that is. A just war is always trying to serve the interests of peace. So everything is done here with the spirit, again, of creating the conditions under which the war can end. And if you violate all these, and especially this, the prisoners are mistreated, so they survive and they go back into their home communities, and they've been treated poorly, then the likelihood of the hostilities remaining, and you increase the likelihood of hostilities breaking out into a hot war again. And in that sense, the proper treatment of prisoners is in line with the spirit of everything. Is this increases the odds of the war being able to come to a conclusion, and thus serve the whole idea of bringing about peace. So there you go. There's the two distinctions. And remember, the key thing is what is the relationship between these two? Traditionally, they were regarded more or less as separate, although historically they were all bound up with each other. But you can say the orthodox view, more or less articulated by, here, I have it right here, by Michael Walzer in this book, stressed that the two were logically separate. little bit of an overstatement, no doubt, but we'll forgive him for that. But then the reaction to that was, no, they're not really separate. They're of a piece, and so that you can't really fight justly if you're fighting for, and let's say, a cause like Nazism, an evil cause like that. Nonetheless, the whole spirit of the just war tradition is one thing: that war is only justified under a strict set of conditions, both in terms of its starting, its continuing, and ultimately with the goal of ending itself, right? War is an instrument ultimately in the service of peace, and everything is geared to bring about the successful operation of essentially peace building.